Welcome! Today we're going to be discussing Kate Chopin's The Awakening and all of the historical and background information that you need to know surrounding that text. Remember that as you listen to this presentation, you should have either your computer notes pulled up or a pen and paper because you will be taking notes and you'll be turning those notes in for the assignment on watching this presentation. First off, Kate Chopin was born as Catherine of Flattery in 1850 or 1851. There is some debate about the actual year she was born, but we know it was around that time. She was born in St. Louis, Missouri. Her father was Thomas. He immigrated from Ireland and ultimately died in a railroad accident when Kate was only 5 years old. Kate's mother was named Eliza, and she was of French descent. Notably, she was 23 years younger than Kate's father. So there was quite the age difference right there. And also, Kate was Catholic, so she grew up surrounded by Catholic influence. In addition, Kate's parents were slave owners who supported the Confederacy, and this was something that troubled Kate. She noticed racism around her, and ultimately she ended up actually writing about it to an extent. Kate's family life. She had 2 brothers and 1 sister. However, all of them died. Kate lived the longest out of the whole family. Kate's brother, George, was a Confederate soldier. He died in the Civil War. He was a half-sibling from her father's first marriage. That first wife, I do not know her name, but she died during childbirth prior to the time when Kate's father married Eliza, Kate's mother. In addition, Thomas Jr. was Kate's other brother who died in a buggy accident. And then lastly, Jane was Kate's only sister, and she died only 1 year after Kate's father was killed in the railroad accident. So Kate would have only been 6 years old when her only sister passed away. Kate grew up surrounded by wonderful educational opportunities. She was well acquainted with the French language and the culture also because her mother was French. Kate's grandmother, her great-grandmother, actually tutored Kate in speaking French and writing French, and all of this French influence definitely shows itself in The Awakening, as you'll see once you begin reading. Also, Kate attended the Academy of the Sacred Heart in 1868, and this school, while it did provide very rigorous, very complete curriculum that helped Kate become a very proficient writer, it also focused on more traditional aspects of womanhood, such as marriage and motherhood, modesty, and how to be submissive, essentially how to be a good stereotypical wife figure. Now, ladies listening, you may hear this and think this is not necessarily what you would expect out of your high school education or your college education, but at the time this would have been rather standard in any kind of education that was influenced by Catholicism. Also, Kate was raised largely by her mother and her grandmother after her dad died in the railroad accident, so Kate always was surrounded by very strong female influences. In addition to all of this education, Kate also learned how to play the piano. Kate got married to Oscar Chopin in 1870, and he was a bit older than her, but not the same distance as between Kate's parents. Oscar was only 6 years older, and once again, Kate found herself in a situation where she was with a white supremacist, with someone who supported the slave economy. So she definitely continued to face the challenges that she had begun facing growing up in a family of slaveholders. Kate and Oscar had several children, altogether 5 sons and 1 daughter, and for a short amount of time, Kate did live in France to escape the Civil War, the post-Civil War time in America. So when it came to work, of course, Oscar would have been the one expected at this time period to provide for the family. And so he studied banking so that he could hopefully act as a middleman between cotton growers and cotton buyers. However, right around the time when he decided to do this, there was an epidemic of yellow fever, and there was also a crop failure, which really caused the cotton economy to struggle and to falter, so he did not find as firm a footing as he had hoped in the cotton industry. And because of this, Kate's family decided to move to Clouderville, Louisiana. Now, once in Clouderville, Kate had her sixth child, and this is also where Oscar ultimately died of malaria, and this was around the year 1882. Now, while in Louisiana, Kate also had an affair, and this would have been very, very scandalous at the time, and it would have caused Kate to get a negative reputation in her community. It would have been hard not only for her to remarry, but also for her to have any of her writing published. And because of this, Kate and her children returned to St. Louis, Missouri. And this is where Kate lived with her mother for just a little while, but her mother actually died very soon after returning to St. Louis. While here, Kate finally became an author. She had the opportunity to get her work out there, and she did not back down. Once she had the opportunity to get her words on pages and have them published, she talked about disease, she talked about racism, she talked about adultery, all of these things that had impacted her life in very negative ways. She talked about them, and she was not afraid to discuss the things that people around her would have found challenging to discuss, or maybe not even had the guts to discuss in the first place. By the age of 39, Kate was a published author, and she had several of her short stories and her poems published in magazines. The first surviving short story from Kate Chopin was titled Emancipation, A Life of Fable. She also had a novel titled At Fault. This was not as successful of a novel as The Awakening, but it was her first novel, and so that is an important thing to know about her. Also, Kate did publish a book that was a collection of short stories titled The Bayou Folk. So if you enjoy reading The Awakening, you might want to check out At Fault or The Bayou Folk. Next, the writer of The Necklace, the writer of The Necklace, Guy de Maupassant, he wrote stories in French, and she loved his writing so much that she decided to translate several of his stories from French into English, and she was able to use her knowledge of the French language and the French culture in doing this. Also, the failure of At Fault, Kate's first novel, paired with inspiration from her favorite author, helped her concentrate on writing short fiction during the 1890s. And finally, Kate was able to publish a collection of short stories titled A Night in the Arcade in 1897. Eventually, Kate died in St. Louis of a brain hemorrhage. Here's a picture of The Awakening, the text that we'll be reading in here, and here's a picture of Kate to put a face with the name. So here's a little bit of information for you guys about The Awakening. This was her second novel, following At Fault. It was published in 1899, and this text is about what she noticed and experienced while she was living in New Orleans. Many people think that this text is based on Kate's own marriage. And remember, that marriage ended rather negatively with her committing adultery and her husband dying of malaria. Upon first being published, this book was received very, very poorly. People called it sickening, they called it selfish, and they even said it is not a healthy book. If that doesn't make you want to read it, I don't know what will. It's one of those books that has caused much outrage over the years among people who found her topics simply not appropriate for a woman to be thinking about or a woman to be writing about. And it was also her last published book. It definitely left an impression. The Awakening is literary realism, and throughout the text, you'll notice that there is much spiritual and moral growth or evolution in the characters. Also, local color is very prevalent throughout Kate Chopin's writing of The Awakening. Local color is essentially fiction or poetry that focuses on characters or customs or the way of speaking, dialect, and other aspects that are specific to a region. So an example of local color would be if you read a story that is specifically set in Atlanta, Georgia, and it has elements that make Atlanta, Atlanta, such as words like y'all or ain't. It might have references to specific musicians or artists who are from the Atlanta area. It would reference specific foods, probably Chick-fil-A, Coca-Cola products. Those are some elements that would make local color fiction if it was in Atlanta, Georgia. But Kate's local color ties to New Orleans, Louisiana. So she mentions specific characteristics and customs that come from New Orleans. Also, Kate was very interested in capturing realistic consequences of social conventions that put limits on certain groups within society. So she would definitely look at class, but also women and how certain expectations for women would limit women. A couple things to note about what was going on at the time in history when Kate Chopin was writing. First off, the Civil War was happening. We've already mentioned this. We know her brother George was killed during the Civil War. Also, the treatment of women was certainly beginning to grow and evolve during this period of time. Women were beginning to slowly be seen more as rational beings who are human, who can actually think for themselves, rather than individuals. But this was not to a full extent, because although there was some recognition that women could think for themselves and women could make their own choices, there was still this idea that women first should be wives and mothers. So this was limited in prevalence, but there was a growing idea that women could be independent. But there was definitely still a more conservative base at this time that would have viewed women as entities that should solely focus on their role in the home or their role in relationship to their husband. Also of note, there was a civil war occurring in France at this time, which impacted Kate and her family while she lived in France briefly. Life in New Orleans was deeply influenced by the Creole lifestyle, which was full of beautiful music. It had a very sinful reputation because they were known for partying on the Sabbath day, and other stereotypes that would have been associated with the Creole lifestyle are drinking, gambling, playing lotteries, and dancing. And whether or not you find these things to be actually sinful, at the time they would have been labeled as sinful or viewed as negative things to do with your time. Also, the treatment of blacks after the Civil War would have been something that definitely impacted the way Kate would write. For example, there's mention of quadroon women, and you'll see race coming up frequently. You will see elements of racism in the text as we read. And then finally, religion. There's significant difference between the Catholic French Creoles and the Presbyterians. And there was much split between these religious groups, and you'll see elements of split religiously as we read The Awakening as well. A quote that I'd like to share with you guys just to think about as we read through The Awakening says, "Each reader of The Awakening must decide whether to view Edna Pontellier experience as positive or negative, or both. Of what does her awakening consist? How does one interpret the ending? Is Edna doomed or freed?" In the book, Kate Chopin has provided a complex story that admits of no easy answers, but is sure to raise some questions. So guys, my video is about to hit 15 minutes, and the tool I'm using to record will not go past 15 minutes. So I'm going to pause right here and start a second video to finish up this presentation.